Hello, and welcome back to the Earn Your Badge from Home program. Today, y'all are going to be building a really fun game, actually using JavaScript, HTML, and a little bit of CSS, and also going to be continuing to review those topics that we talked about before with functions and variables. Just to review a little bit, functions are those essentially mini sets of instructions that you write in your code to implement in a bunch of different places, and it really saves you as a programmer a lot of time, and it also makes your code a lot more organized. Variables are something you are never going to stop using. They are just simply easy ways for us to store information, and they come in really handy. So building on top of that, we're going to keep learning about other awesome principles of computer science today. And I hope you guys enjoyed making this game, and feel free to totally share it with your friends and family and see if they can play it as well. So let's take a look at what your completed version of your project is going to be. Now, don't worry, you don't have to write all of this code from scratch. You'll get a template, so don't worry, it's not going to be super overwhelming. So basically, the way that this game works is you're trying to guess whatever color that these three values represent. Now, if you're not too familiar, in computer science, the way that colors are created is by using three numerical values. It's basically called an RGB value, where it basically means the amount of red, green, and blue that it takes to create a color. So you're mixing certain amounts of red, green, and blue to create different colors using computer pixels. And these numbers, it goes all the way, each of them can go all the way up from 0 to 255. And just saying if this amount of red is more increased, you have a color that looks more on the red side, and so forth, right? So you are trying to guess out of these 6 dots that are placed here, which color that these three values represent. And as you play the game, you can come up with some strategies. So it's really not guessing in the dark, but say I click on this one. So it's wrong, and it's going to give me a message that says wrong, guess again, and then I'm going to try to click on the button that I think is the correct answer. So let me try this one instead. Okay, so this one is correct. So if I want to play again, I can hit reset game, and it'll give me a new set of 6 colors and three new values for us to try to guess with this. Now, what these question marks are in this bottom right-hand corner is I can click on them, and it gives my user instructions on how to play the game. So it says click on the colored circle you'd think matches the 3 RGB values. So RGB values are going to be something that if you work with graphics, anything to do with how a computer visually represents colors or images, you're going to be running into these a lot. So it's always good to get acquainted with them early. So let's figure out how we are going to code this thing up. So for starters, with building this game, let's get our little instruction icon going. So an icon that you're probably already familiar with is maybe you see, it's just some sort of little mini picture on your screen that when you click on it, it has some sort of role. Usually not a huge role, it just does something. So our icon for this game is going to be this little circle that looks like our question marks that the user can click on in case they're not familiar with the instructions for your game. So most of the code for this is already there. We are going to pay attention to these button tags, which are what allow us to have something that we can click on. And usually with buttons, it looks more like this, where it's that like gray rectangle with text over top of it. Well, you can also make pictures buttons, which is what we've also done here with these circles. So I took a picture off the internet that looked like question marks, and I copied the image address and I labeled that as the source, which is what this piece does. And then we also have our alternative message in case the image address is something that our computer can't recognize. This portion here that says style is how we can affect our position, the position of our icon. So I want you to click here in this empty space that's been left after top and left, and right after they say PX. PX, essentially, it stands for pixels. And so we are going to give our picture an amount of pixels it should be from the top. So if it's a really small amount, it'll be really close to the top. And then same thing with left, we're going to say how far left it should be. So I'm going to say from the top, let's give it 350. And then after left, let's say I want it to move pretty far out left. So I'm going to say about 500. And then to test it out, I'm going to hit run and see how it moved down here. Now that was a little too low for me. I want it closer to the top. So I'm going to decrease this number. Let's try 300 instead. Hit run again here. Okay, now we can see it a little better, but it's still not quite in that far bottom right corner. So let's move it a little bit more left as well. Let's try 50, seems like it should be enough. So I'm clicking right here after left and top. There, now we can see it a little better now. And then I can get rid of those extra spaces there as well. The spaces are left there to hopefully make it easier for you to find it within the code. This is in the HTML section. I'm going to hit run, and it's pretty good there. Maybe even a little bit more. Let's just try 575 because I'm a little picky. Okay, that looks good. So it's there in the bottom right corner. And the last portion here is we are saying class equals icon. Now what that means is, if you look over here in the CSS section, there is something called an icon class created. Now that is basically what allows us to make this image look prettier. This is how I'm able to make it. It's 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels tall. If I were to make this larger, the picture is going to be huge as well. So if I were to adjust that and I hit run, picture we can't even see it because it's huge, but there it is. So obviously we don't want that, so I'm going to change it back, but that's just to show you all what would happen if I did change that. We haven't worked with CSS before as a group, but basically it's what makes your website look pretty. It gives you much more control over how it will look, allows you to add a bunch of different colors. So HTML is how things get structured, how text and everything gets structured on the screen. CSS is to make it all look pretty, and JavaScript is to make it much more dynamic. It gives your code a little bit of a brain, and it also makes things look better. So that is pretty much all we're going to do in the HTML side. The rest of our work is going to be focused with JavaScript, getting it to actually understand what button the user is clicking on, getting it to actually to pick a random RGB value, a random set of red, green, and blue to create this brand new color to be considered the correct one out of 6 other random sets of colors. As well as changing what this text here says and getting the reset game button working. So a lot to do, but it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so that is the icon class. Now, one last thing here is if I hit run and I still click on this, nothing's happening. Instructions aren't showing up. Well, we haven't added something here the same way we have style and class. We have to have some sort of reference to get our, we haven't told our button right now that it needs to be clicked on. In order to do that, I am going to say on click. So right after icon, outside of the quotations, but still inside of that little, it kind of looks like a greater than symbol. Inside of that, I'm going to say on click. Let's even make this a little wider so we can see it better. And I'm going to say on click. That is what allows our button to know, okay, when somebody clicks it, I have to run some sort of instruction. So here, there's already a instructions function written for you that will run, but the only thing is, basically what it's going to do is it's very similar to when you were building pictures, perhaps if you did your first Coding for Good badge with STEM for Scouts, where when you clicked on a button, an image appeared. Instead of an image appearing, we're going to have text appearing now. So here we say we've written a function already that can take in text and put it out, take in text using JavaScript and then make it look nice on HTML. But we have to now, inside of instructions, tell it what text it needs to take in. And then once we finish this function, we're going to call it up here after onClick. We're going to say this function that's now completed is going to run. So inside of src, inside of source, this is where we are going to type in the instructions for our game. So I am going to say click on the colored circle that you think matches the given RGB value. Still inside of those quotations, so it knows that it's working with text. So now our instructions look completed. Now we're going to say, okay, when my button actually gets clicked on, run this set of instructions, this function here, to display how to play the game. So I'm going to say on click, and all we're going to do is we are going to say inside of quotations, type in instructions, because that's the name of my function. I'm going to say parentheses, and then I'm going to add a semicolon at the end. Still all inside of those quotations. So now let's make things a little smaller in here so we can see our full game. And I'd recommend, honestly, when you want to see your full game, keep it, see when you decrease and increase it, notice how that little black rectangle appears that says like 686 pixels. That's saying how long this is. So it gives us kind of a way to reference when you are trying to place things around the screen in reference to pixels, because that's what we did here before. I'm going to keep mine relatively for now at like 655. So I'm going to click on this now. Well, let me hit run first. Important, hit run first, otherwise you might not necessarily see the changes you've made, and you might get confused as to why things look good code-wise but aren't working. So just hit the run button. It's a mistake that I make all the time too. So click here, and now it says click on the colored circle that you think matches the given RGB value, which is exactly what we typed up here. So now let's focus on getting these colored buttons to actually be random colors every time we hit our run button. So for starters, what we are going to do is we are going to create an array of these colored button objects. Now, that's a lot. What do those words mean? So basically, what we've created up here with our CSS is these are our color buttons. This is a color button class. It's essentially a section, it's just another section of code that's determined this is what all our buttons are going to start out by looking like. And then we are going to implement, this is just teaching them how to look. It's just saying what each of the colored circles have to look like. And then it gets implemented over here, and now they get turned into buttons. So now they stop from being just colored circles to actually having some sort of function as buttons. And then we are going to say, okay, in JavaScript, let me create an array, let me organize them in a way that which I can access them and basically have them all run similar commands without me having to write the same code over and over again. So to get a little bit of a better understanding of what an array is, let's actually take a second to draw it out and have as I explain it, because I think it'll help y'all understand them a little better. So an array in computer science is something we call a data structure. There are a bunch of different kinds of data structures. I'm going to say it comes from the category of data structure. Now, big fancy term for something that means just different ways for us to hold, organize, and access sets or pieces of information. So an array is a type of data structure. Other ones you might learn about are array lists, which work a little differently. Maybe dictionaries. Sounds like a fancy word. But basically, the one we're going to focus on today is an array. So I'm going to get rid of other of these, but these are just important words for you to maybe keep in mind. Say you were to learn another language, like Python is where you use dictionaries. It's another way to store and access information. And honestly, I really encourage you to look them up, say like dictionaries in Python, and just see what comes up. They're really, really cool. But let's just keep learning about arrays first. Now, with an array, all it is a way for us to store multiple pieces of information under one location or place, I guess you'd say, or in one spot. So usually what we do is when we think of variables, we say, okay, a variable is a way for us to hold one piece of information. Now just think about a variable as essentially being one big one box. So let me draw that out. So this is my variable. And in this box, I'm going to hold the number 7. All an array is a bigger box that can hold a bunch of other little pieces. So now with an array, the only difference is we're used to looking at variables just holding one small piece. Now all an array does is it's a bigger box, and I'm holding a bunch of little boxes inside of it. So maybe this one says 6. Maybe this box says 4. Maybe this box says 2, whatever. It could be any number. It could even be text. It could be decimals. It could be other objects. Say you wanted to create, in this game, we are using buttons, right? We can use an array to hold a bunch of different colored buttons. So the way we can actually access this information is each of them have their own specified location within the box. So all that is just the order that which they're in. So number 4's location would be determined by the fact it's the second element in this box. Remember, we're just reading it from left to right. Only thing is, again, with computers, we start at the number 0 rather than 1. Obviously, when you guys are used to counting, you're counting from starting at 1, 2, 3, and so on. With computers, you include 0. So 6 actually has a location of 0. 4 has a location of 1. 2 has a location of 3. That's the only 2 has a location of 2. Only difference is you're starting with 0 instead of 1. That's all it is. It's nothing big or scary. So if I wanted to retrieve 7 with my variable, all I would have to do is just take, for example, say this variable's name is, I don't know, we're going to say the variable name is number or num, right? In order for me to retrieve 7, all I have to do is call num somewhere else, and I'm done. Slightly similar process with an array. With an array, let's say this array has, its name is going to be number num set. It's a set of numbers. That's what I'm going to do, okay? Now, all I have to do to retrieve, say I wanted to retrieve the number 4, all I have to do is say, okay, let me be a little bit more specific. Before, with variable, all I had to do was say the name and I was done. But here, okay, num set could represent 3 different values, which is why we have to be a little bit more specific. So we say, okay, if I want to retrieve the number 4, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, give me the name of my array, num set, and give me the location of whatever the item I'm trying to receive is. Okay, the location is 1. Another word for location is index. This is a word that you're going to be more familiar with. Index means location of an element. Element is each of these little boxes. All right? So all of your little boxes holding some sort of information. So 6, 4, and 2 are each elements. Their locations denoted by 0, 1, 2, and if you wanted to keep adding 6 or 7 more boxes, the index would just continue going up by 1. Their locations are their index. Okay, so I'm trying to retrieve the number 4. Let me look at the index. Its index is 1, so I'm going to put that inside of a set of hard brackets. That's a syntax thing. And then I'm able to retrieve this. So if I say I wanted to even reset whatever was sitting at location number 1, say I wanted this box to now hold 5, I can just say equals, because same way with equals, when you're declaring variables, you use a single equal sign. I can say numset 1 now equals 12. So when my computer is now looking at my array, this is what my array would look like now. It's still a big box with 3 elements in it. Now, what is at index 2? So index 0 didn't change. There's nothing there telling it to. So it's still 6. Now, whatever's at index 1 is now equal to 12. So now that number is 12, and 2 is still 2. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an insight onto what arrays are. Okay, so now that we kind of have a better understanding of what arrays look like, we are going to create our own array of colored buttons. So to do that, I'm going to start out by saying var buttons. That is how I'm going to say, okay, that is the name of my array. That is the name of my set of colored buttons. And then I am going to say get elements by class name. Remember, we created color button class. And inside, what's the name of it? Color button, which is why I'm going to type that inside. So now it knows what I'm creating an array of. It's like, oh, okay, they created a bunch of color button objects. We are going to have a set of them now that we can all manipulate. So what's going to happen through the rest of our code is basically we're going to find a way to create random colors, and then we're going to assign it to each of these buttons. So to make our lives easier with that, when you have them all stored in the same place, you have these advantages that JavaScript gives you to be able to move through them all stored in the same place and apply the same instructions for each button, because each of these buttons work pretty much the same. You just have 6 of them. So it saves you a lot of time because you can apply what you've done to all of them. So let's actually figure out how we can make a random color here. So like I mentioned before, RGB values they go from 0 to 255. 255 essentially meaning it's the most saturated form of the color that you can have. So for each of those, it could be 255, 255, 255 is the highest it could be, and 000 is the lowest it can be. And anything in between, any sort of combination in between, it brings you a new color, which is why, since you have so many different options and so many different variations, I think computers can make like 16 million different colors or something like that. Rough number off the top of my head. But let's actually figure out how we can make a random color. Well, since they are a bunch of numbers put together, what we can do is just tell it to make, for each of those RGB values, tell it to just pick a random number between 0 and 255. So I'm going to have a random number between 0 and 255 for red, green, and blue. And then I'm going to assign those all, I'm going to combine them all together to be for one button. So all we have to do for this function that says make color value is inside, I am going to figure out how I can pick a random number between 0 and 255. And then we are going to apply that for red, green, and blue here in this function underneath. So what I'm going to do is I am going to say math.random, and put open and close parentheses, hit shift number 8 so I can get the asterisk symbol, and say 255. Now what this means is math.random is a built-in function in JavaScript. It basically says it will pick any random number starting at 0. That's just a given instruction. That's something that's built in. And when we say times 255, that is us saying that is the largest number that it could possibly pick. It's you specifying your range. So we are going to take advantage of that function. And one last thing, this math.random function, it produces a decimal. So we are going to take advantage of another math function that occurs in Java. And we are going to say math.round, which, like you can assume, it rounds it to the nearest whole number so that we get a whole number for an RGB value. So here it might pick a random number that's 177.5. We just wanted to change that to be 178 because we don't want to deal with decimals. One last thing is we have a random number now that's a whole number. We want this function to output it. We want to actually be able to use this number somewhere else. That is why I am going to write return here at the front of my statement. Return is basically your function spitting out some sort of answer, and we are actually able to save that answer perhaps in a variable and use it in other pieces of our code, which makes it really helpful. And last thing, I'm going to hit semicolon because it's important to have that at the end of your lines in JavaScript. So that make color value function looks good. Now let's use it inside of our set button color. Now what this does is it's saying, what we're going to do is we are going to run this make color value function 3 times, once for setting red, green, and blue. And then we're going to set those 3 colors to be the color of our button. So to make this set button color function, what we are going to do is we are going to write something that is going to take a button, any given button. These are all arguments. These are the inputs that go into our function. And it's basically going to give it the code to know how to actually take 3 given RGB values and turn it into a color and assign it to that button. This is not where we are going to implement make color value. We are going to put that in a function that's more below. This is just us teaching the computer how to take any given colors and turn it into a button. So now we are going to enter this start game function. This is like the home stretch. We're getting close. This is the function that's actually going to make your game really work. It's going to implement these functions that we'd written above, as well as do a couple extra things. So what this answer button variable does is it's just storing the location, the index, like we talked about earlier, of the button that is going to be considered the correct one for that round. So then what we're going to do is we're going to look inside of this loop. Now this is called a for loop. A for loop is a loop that will run whatever commands we've placed inside. So in this case, pretty much all of this, it will run it a fixed amount of times. In this case, we want this loop to run for as many buttons that we have. So that is what this top line means. So you're creating some sort of instruction at the top for when your computer's reading through this. It's going to say, oh, I'm entering a loop. Until I get to this bottom and have gone through whatever instructions are placed in here 6 times, it's not going to exit and look at whatever's placed underneath. So that's what this does. And we are going to have it. This is one of the advantages of having an array. I can write an instruction for how to set a singular button just one time, and the loop will do the rest of the work for me and run that set of instructions 6 times. Now we're seeing why writing functions can also be really helpful. So for starters, let's figure out just how we can get all those colors actually set, right? We have a way for us to find a random color, and we have a way for our button to understand how to set those colors to look like that. Let's actually give it the colors to do that with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 3 variables. I'm going to say var red, and then I'm going to say var green and blue. But first, this is where I'm going to call that make color value function. So I'm going to store whatever random number, whatever random RGB value, or I guess you could say whatever singular number between 0 and 255 I get is going to be stored under this variable red. So I'm going to say make color value. Notice how it still matches the name of our function. That's why we give our function's name. And then 2 parentheses and a quotations. So now I'm calling that. And then we're just going to do that 2 more times to get a random number for green as well. Make color value. And then our parentheses, and then 1 more time for blue. Okay, so I have my 3 colors set. Now let's get our button to actually assign those colors to itself. That's where we're going to use that set button color function. So I'm going to call my set button color. So I'm going to call my set button color function. I'm going to say set button color, and then inside, well, there's 4 arguments here, so I have to give it 4 sort of input, right? And we already know what red, green, and blue are going to be because I store them inside of variables, but it's the same thing as me writing make color value 3 times within these parentheses. Since we made them into variables, it makes a lot more sense as to what is going where. But first, I have to give it some sort of button. It needs to know where these colors are going, right? Well, again, let's refer back to the array of buttons we created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say buttons. So that is the name of my array, my structure that's holding 6 buttons. And then I'm going to say, okay, remember, the way you can access elements stored in an array is by saying, give me an array and give me the location, and the array will do the rest of the work and it'll spit out whatever is stored there. And that is what we want because we're trying to access the button. So I am going to type in I here. Now the reason what this does is the way, again, that this for loop works is it's going to traverse through each of the indices that this array has. So I, see how it says var I is essentially like a temporary variable you're creating that it only is applicable to anything that is inside of the loop. I is simply just integers. It's just 0 through 5 because those are the indice values that we have for our buttons. So we can use that to our advantage when we're trying to access our actual buttons because, again, we know the array that they're coming from. The array is buttons, and now we can use I to access each of the individual indices. Every time that this loop runs, I will increment by 1. So the first time this loop runs, I will be 0. The next time this loop runs, I will be 1. So now we're saying, okay, I can access the button that's at indice 0. I can also access the button that's indice 1, and so forth all the way through 5. So that is how we are going to access our button. And then it's just a matter of typing red, green, and blue because we are using each of these values here to get those 3 random values. So now our button that we're working through has a color. So next, so remember that piece that is replacing hello world? It actually gives us those 3 RGB values that we are trying to guess which color holds. We are going to write the portion that actually makes those 3 values, those random values that we set up here, to actually display in our HTML side. So here, that is what this command line does. But here's the thing. We don't just want any random set of RGB values. We want them to be the RGB values of the random button within our array that we selected to be considered the answer, to be considered the correct one. So again, all this is simply an indice value from 0 to 5. So the conditional that we are going to be placing here is we are going to be saying, this line is what prints out the RGB values of whatever was considered the correct answer button. So the only time that this should be printed out is when our for loop is moving through, is setting the values of answer button. And the way we know that is we said, okay, answer button has a certain index, 0 through 5. One time as it's running through will match the index that answer button is equal to, right? So all we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, if the button that we're moving through, the button that we are setting its color to and everything is I, so all I have to do is say answer button. So that is the variable that we were talking about earlier. Don't worry. If it equals I, we want to say equals because a singular equals means that you're declaring a variable. If you have 2 equals, that means you're comparing 2 values. So I'm going to say if it equals I, because now if the indices match, we are going to place this line that essentially prints out its RGB values inside. So I'm just going to hit I'm going to hit Control X to cut, and then I'm going to hit paste inside. If you don't want to cut and paste, it's as simple as you can just write your conditional and then create your open curly brackets and get rid of that closing one, and then just add a closing curly brackets. The way you can add curly brackets is find the key that is directly next to the P, like the letter P on your keyboard. And so you'll see like a hard bracket, and then hit Shift, and then you'll find the curly bracket. Okay, so now we are able to only check when we're working with answer button, and when we will get its RGB values. So I'm going to hit run. Notice how nothing works. Well, here's the thing. Notice how this is what.innerHTML. We don't have anything to reference called what. There's no reference there. We are trying to get our header to be those 3 values, right? And if you look up a little more above, notice how we say heading.innerHTML equals hello world, and that is what's being printed out here. So heading is what we are trying to change. So I'm going to comment this out. I can easily comment it out by hitting the slash that's directly underneath the question mark next to the shift key. And then inside of my conditional, we are going to change this to say heading instead. So we are going to replace that line with those 3 values. So now it knows what it is referencing. So now let me hit run. And now we got our 3 RGB values. So now that we have this if statement written, we have our set of RGB values that we're trying to guess. One last thing that we are going to do to finish out this game is we are going to get an actual message running when we click on it, because right now this says first and second message, which is kind of lame. So that's why we are going to look inside of this portion of our JavaScript code. Now what this does is it checks, this line 40 here, it checks if we are actually clicking on the button. And if we are clicking on the button, what this if statement does is it says, okay, if the button you're clicking on is the correct one, then put out this message. If you're clicking on the incorrect one, basically if you're clicking on any other button that's not the correct one, that's what an else does, it will put out this message. So here, since this is where the correct message should go, we are just going to type in correct instead of first message. And here we are just going to say wrong, try again. Now when I hit run, it says correct. And then if I click on something that's wrong, nothing works. I'm going to click on my question mark. We can see how those instructions are displaying. And when I hit reset, everything goes back to normal. All that reset really does is remember that this is a function. So we have this whole giant start game function, and everything inside of it is basically what it takes to make this all actually run and work, right? Here on line 51 is where we are actually telling our game to run every time I hit the run button. And what I'm going to do is say, okay, when we click on our reset button, notice how there's also an event listener here, same way how we have an event listener here. That's, again, our code is checking for when that button gets clicked on. All we're going to do is tell that start game function to run again. And although JavaScript isn't super picky syntax-wise, it's super important to get into the practice of this, add an extra set of parentheses right after, because that is how the proper way to call a function. So here, function will run once every time I hit run, and every time we hit reset, we've given our code the ability to make it run again from the beginning. And then at this point, this is your guess the color game all complete. You should be very proud of yourself. This is not an easy game to make. See if you can figure out some strategies when it comes to trying to figure out the spots. I will say I always look at what number holds the majority. So here I'm seeing a lot of 187 and a lot of 124. But enough green to not really be discounted. So I'm going to say it's either one of these two colors, I'm guessing. So it's not that, it is that. So, because again, if you have a lot of red and blue in there, that means it's probably going to be purple or something closer to that. When you have numbers that are all relatively close, it makes it a lot harder. Maybe this one, but there. So those are just a couple of my strategies for playing the game. So now you can one-up your family, obviously, since you're the one who made it. I hope you guys had fun making this, and congratulations on earning your second Coding for Good badge.